Thank you so much. Let me start off with the latest development in the public policy discourse in Washington. The situation is that people don't agree on what day of the week it is these days. And as I predict going into the future, people might not agree on what direction the sun rises and sets. And when asked about artificial intelligence, Amos Tversky seems to have said that he was more interested in people's natural stupidity. And that kind of takes me to the core of my presentation here. How do you deal with people's value systems when it comes to modeling and visualization of various parameters that we get to deal with in the scientific community? And as a systems engineer who's trained to look at, trained to develop requirements and specifications and taught to look at readiness levels and so forth, this is an unusual situation. And with the Chuck Phelps, Rita Colville, Reno Rapulli, and Harvey Feinberg. In recent years, I've been looking at some of these major issues, especially relating to how do you arrive at social choices that are that oftentimes describe the public policy conundrums that we encounter. Ultimately, humans, not machines or machine learning, determine what creates value. So it's a serious issue that we get to deal with. Let me give you a specific example of how this really applies in the world of public health. Let me take us back to about 3 years ago when we started having this global public panic relating to the Ebola outburst. And there was a serious cacophony and a lot of ideas started spreading, a lot of doubt, skepticism surrounding the development of new vaccines, drugs, and how do we go about countering this rapid spread of the infection. And then we quickly turned into various approaches, including quarantining travelers. We even stopped some trade routes and looked at other policies and treaties to really effectively curb the spread of the infection. And we also quickly bumped into this hurdle that we did not directly think about, and that was relating to the local contextual issues relating to burial rights. And the World Health Organization reported that about 20% of the infections were actually caused due to the rituals directly. So this was not really a parameter that we even thought about, and oftentimes plays a major issue in regards to the anthropological and the cultural influences in major policy issues. Then we also learned that we had a candidate for Ebola vaccine about 15 years ago, at least a decade ago, but we somehow failed to let it advance from its state. And there are various reasons surrounding it. One might be, one was actually low policy interest, and the other one related to low commercial enthusiasm surrounding the product itself, given the low incident rates, at least in advanced countries and so forth. So these are real issues. When we have potential solutions for scenarios that we get to deal with, how do you go about truly prioritizing what's important? And to state this differently, how did we get into the current situation, or how did our planning and policy efforts really lead us to this situation? And to better understand that question, it would be really helpful to look at the prevailing analytical practices that dominate the world of public health policy. Especially in regards to vaccine priority setting, two principal approaches have dominated much of the 20th century policy advising. If you look at about 30 years ago, the National Academies put out a pair of reports, one focused on prioritizing vaccine development for the United States and another one for developing countries. Both provided a rank-ordered list of vaccine candidates based on a single metric, infant mortality equivalent. In modern language, we might call it life years saved. But 15 years later, the academies conducted another study that also provided a rank-ordered list of vaccine candidates for development using a single metric based on cost effectiveness. Let's reflect a little bit on cost effectiveness. It comes from the very strong heritage of thermodynamics, widely applied in the world of engineering in the early stages, and deeply rooted in the economic theory, and also very popular and appealing for analysts because it enables analysts to represent the health benefits in natural units in the context of quality-adjusted life years or disability-adjusted life years, and cost effectiveness overall calculated as dollars divided by quality-adjusted life years or disability-adjusted life years. Outcomes of value, you use that as a threshold, and if the number exceeds the threshold or goes below the threshold, you make the relevant decision. So it's really a solid theoretical framework to understand these things. However, it is very clear that these are very narrow metrics, and they do miss out on broader societal issues that do and often can affect public policy progress. And that was very evident in the case of Ebola, because if we used cost effectiveness metrics, we missed out on a lot of parameters that really did matter in the context of dread diseases like Ebola that have potential to create a lot of disruption. So, at the request of the Department of Health and Human Services, in response to the National Vaccine Plan, at the academies, we conducted an unusual project over the past few years. It is something what we call a transitional approach. It was a project that led to a real a product development effort, a software package over the past few years. And we call it SMART Vaccines, consistent with the Washington tradition of creating an acronym for everything, Strategic Multi-Attribute Ranking Tool for Vaccines. And what it did was, over the years, took a much more comprehensive approach to merely bring together a wide range of parameters that are otherwise completely ignored or dismissed from analysis. So that was the fundamental contribution, and it employed a multi-criteria systems approach, specifically using the tools of multi-attribute utility theory, widely used in the arena of environmental planning, nuclear waste disposal, urban planning, homeland security, and so forth. So we merely borrowed it from the world of engineering and applied it to public health. And you can see here a big table that contains various domains. For example, it contains about 28 attributes as a basic package, looking at health considerations. So each of these parameters represents a trade-off one wishes to make. And so it also provides an organized framework to think through vaccine development against these attributes. For example, does the vaccine avert premature deaths or incident cases? Can it create gains in quality-adjusted life years? And if you look at the classic economic considerations, can it create savings associated with the use of vaccine annually, workforce productivity gains, cost effectiveness, and also demographic considerations, which includes the benefit of the vaccine directed to a special population or even a specific population, looking at infants and children, women, socioeconomically disadvantaged population, or military population, and other priority population, let's say immunocompromised individuals or native populations and so forth. So it enables you to customize the population focus. Similarly, public concerns associated with the vaccines, looking at alternative public health measures. Do you really want to put tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars in new vaccine development when you could potentially counteract the complication through a range of other approaches? For example, in malaria, providing mosquito nets or clean water in a community and sanitation and so forth. So it enables you to take a more portfolio type approach. And looking at diseases that have a propensity to create fear and stigma in the public. Ebola is a great example for that. And looking at serious pandemic potential. Of course, scientific and business considerations also flow in, looking at the financial profitability for the manufacturer, production platforms, and also interest from NGOs and philanthropic organizations, which is, they play a major role in the realm of vaccine development. Programmatic considerations are novel in a formal modeling framework such as this, because we often leave it up to the field managers to take care of these things, but I think it's important to consider their relevance as part of the formal setup itself. Can the vaccine improve delivery methods? Can it readily fit into an immunization schedule and reduce challenges relating to cold chain requirements and so forth? And intangible values, which we just talked about a few minutes ago. How do you go about creating a vaccine that could just completely wipe out a disease, which are stated goals of major philanthropic foundations, or even raising public health awareness. In the case of HPV, a vaccine might collaterally help promote safe sex practices. So in this case, it's not just a biological vaccine, but also a social vaccine. So also looking at policy considerations. So if you look at it, in addition to all these 28 attributes, one might create up to 7 additional attributes. It's like a restaurant menu. You don't pick everything. You pick and choose what's most important to you, and then go about presenting your weights and conducting your analysis. And we tested the software, which I'll take you through in a minute, in collaboration with real users. And in this case, our early adopters were Public Health Agency of Canada. They ended up using the tool to prioritize R&D for 2 specific diseases, chlamydia and tuberculosis. And the State Department of Health in New York, they looked at purchasing decisions for rotavirus vaccines. Even though our software was originally created to prioritize R&D efforts, it's worth a mention that users are very imaginative in exploring their own set of uses, which we as developers did not consider. So that was a very insightful collaboration with them. Similarly, Serum Institute of India Limited, they wanted to set their manufacturing priorities for conditions that don't have any vaccines at all, dengue, respiratory syncytial virus, and so forth. We also worked with the Mexican Ministry of Health to prioritize flu vaccines. All this was conducted in collaboration with Microsoft, who brought expertise in conducting these use case analysis and helping us really think through data development in collaboration with them. So it was a real enriching experience for us. Over the past couple years, the software has also in part because of the Ebola crisis, which gave rise to some of its prominence, was also appreciated by a wide range of very different stakeholders. In fact, the World Health Organization recognized the software system as part of its Global Vaccine Action Plan. And Institute Pasteur, which I will talk about in several minutes, embedded the software package as part of its educational curriculum. So there are different applications one might imagine that the developers themselves couldn't. Let me use the example through our software and simultaneously try to explain the software and illuminate how it is essential and possible to go beyond the conventional metrics that we apply for public health analysis. In this case, I'll specifically talk about cost-effectiveness analysis. So the software is free. It's available at this link on the National Academy's press page. Please download, evaluate, and send us feedback. So this is the opening screen of smart vaccines. The key point to note are 2 blocks. One is called specify, one is evaluate. The specify involves 3 specific entry points. The one relating to population, which is, it's a very population-specific software tool, and you have to enter the disease burden and also the vaccine characteristics. Evaluation part is the fun part, where you bring in your value system into the equation here. Pick and choose the attributes that are most important to you. If you're a health minister, you have a different set of attributes. If you're a CTO of a startup, very different set of attributes. You pick and choose what's important to you and bring it into this into the software platform. Apply your weights, and then we look through the priorities. The software, as originally coded, was covering all OECD countries, plus India, plus South Africa, and New York State, as you can see it. And this is all based on WHO classification. As soon as you select a country in this pull-down menu, let's say United States, automatically a big table drops down, and that is standard life table information that can be sourced from World Health Organization. It gets updated periodically, so it has basic parameters like age segments, population information, life years, standard life expectancy, and standard life expectancy. Again, classic epidemiological information that that's available. Also, calculating the hourly wage rate through data from International Labor Organization. Why are we looking at hourly wage rate? Because we're also interested in looking at the broader impact of the vaccines beyond just the public health aspect of it. So economic and sociological elements. So as soon as you do this, so this is the easiest part of it because this is pre-embedded. Next comes the disease burden part, which is, again, where you get to define a disease of your choice. In this case, I defined something called Ebola, which is an imaginary Ebola with characteristics identical to the real Ebola virus. And then you define it for subpopulation. In this case, we segmented it by female, male, and special population, because in case you wanted to just do an analysis on a very regional population, you can do so. And then you enter the basic disease burden. In this case, the Ebola virus, identical to Ebola, affects about 10 people per 100,000 people, with a 50% chance of mortality if you get it. The case fatality rate is pretty high. And then you define illnesses accordingly and put in the associated costs with it. For developed countries, these are available or easily estimable, but for developing countries, this is really hard. So sometimes it's a door-to-door combat in terms of assessing data. So that's a point to keep in mind within this group here, because there are some serious data deficiencies that one gets to deal with. Similarly, vaccine characteristics, largely speculative, because we are talking about vaccines that do not exist yet. You're talking about hypothetical vaccines or aspirational vaccines in this case. So you get to define what in the trade they call the target product profile. So looking at the expected coverage associated with the vaccine. So in this case, Ebola, we're expecting anywhere between 50 to 75% of coverage in a community, with the effectiveness ranging between 60 to 70%. And then there's a herd immunity attachment. It is a very crude model, and the way it is coded is once the coverage reaches 80% in a community, herd immunity is assured. Again, it's a very complex modeling task in its own, but we just stuck with that purely to maintain the usability functionality trade-off given the types of decision makers we were working with. Similarly, the vaccine characteristics offers a hypothetical 5-year protection, 1 dose, costs about $100 a dose, and it costs between $100 to $500 million. Again, very reasonable estimates mirroring what's happening with Ebola. Then you get to pick and choose what the attributes are important. So in this case, I selected cost effectiveness because that was a parameter that we wanted to test out, and then I picked a couple more, and then it takes us to this slide where I have selected about 4 attributes, all relevant to Ebola in this case. Cost effectiveness, disease-raising fear and stigma in the public, serious pandemic potential, eradication or elimination of disease, or if you're anthropologically minded, you can add another attribute, something called dignified burial rights or something that could get a weight as well. So the software, in summary, compares each of these attributes within a range of the worst possible situation and the best possible situation. And it does this quantitatively and qualitatively and allows users to rank what's most important to you. And then it automatically calculates an initial set of weights consistent, which is just a geometric average of all the weights consistent with the rank that the user has provided. So in this case, if cost effectiveness is number 1, it has a maximum possibility of 52% weight. And if that was the only parameter selected for analysis, which I will do so in the next round, the maximum possible score is about 52 or so. So here I'm comparing a flu vaccine, a rotavirus vaccine, pneumococcal vaccine, HPV, and the imaginary Ebola, just to do a portfolio analysis of these things. So on a maximum possible score, I've turned off every other parameters here. Every other parameter is turned off, so it's just a plain cost effectiveness analysis. On a maximum score of 52, you see that flu does really well, pneumococcal and HPV does very, very well based on the inputs that's here. In fact, pneumococcal and HPV create negative cost effectiveness scores, which means they create cost savings. However, Ebola is about $125,000 or so per quality adjusted life year. So you can see it gets a total of 44% in this, or 44 smart score, and it's the laggard. So if you were a health minister prioritizing Ebola among these candidates, it does not perform too well, so it's easy to be excluded. That may have very well happened 15 years ago when the real Ebola vaccine candidate was available for commercialization. Now, if you turn on other attributes that are relevant to us, so you can go step by step and say if flu raises fear and stigma in the public, not really. If it does have a serious pandemic potential, absolutely. Can flu be eradicated or eliminated? Not really. So you ask these questions very systematically and go to Ebola. All these 3 apply to Ebola, and I turn all these 3, and then you see that the results are dramatically different. By merely bringing in these additional factors, whether or not your data are strong or reliable, you completely alter the decisions. And I think that is an important factor to keep in mind as a society we increasingly become polarized and people develop different viewpoints. And especially in the case, even when ministries try to think about this in a very different ways. A finance ministry might do this in a completely different way than a health ministry. So I think what this illustrates is a completely transparent approach, and that shows a weighted contribution of each of the dimensions relating to the technology itself. And this is just to show you, since we're all trained in the culture of maintaining lab notebooks, have all the inputs and outputs clearly displayed with the time stamp and so forth. So the transparency is an immediate benefit of using a systems analysis tool such as this, and that was something that was greatly appreciated among the various user groups. Now, wherever we went with this tool, a question that immediately came up. The tool makes complete sense when an individual uses it. How does a committee or an advisory group use it when you have multiple priority lists emerging out of the entire process? Which kind of took us straight into this big collective choice conundrum that encounters, and that's how I started this talk. Now, because shortly after Ebola, we encountered Zika with a completely different transmission mechanism. It's transmitted by mosquitoes, not human. And then you also have various choices these days for treatments. Let's say if you're dealing with a complex condition like cancer or so forth, how do you enable patients to make more informed decisions? So these are all situations which involve more than one decision maker in a way, with multiple priorities and multiple viewpoints and multiple value systems. So now that's a serious challenge, especially even when it comes to designing portfolios for a health system, whether you buy CT scanners or increase your human resources by 10%. Or so forth. So those are real incomparables in a way, or as Bill Rouse likes to say, how do you envision alternative futures? How do you immerse yourself in a laboratory setting to get a fundamental insight into these issues? That took us into the realm of social choice theory that was pioneered, among others, by Kenneth Arrow through his 1950 doctoral thesis that ended up winning a Nobel Prize, he proved called the impossibility theorem. It is impossible for a society as an aggregate to come up with an optimal decision, among other rules involving, it would involve a dictator. And so that's one way to make a choice as a society, to agree on something universal and proceed with that. Or we engage in more civilized group discussion, or in this case, as a picture, it's a bar fight, and that's how most consensus projects work as well, and because things are complex and the multiple values need to be reconciled. Or we embark on the more democratic process agreed upon voting systems. However, it's important to note these voting rules are subject to manipulation. And there are so many technical criteria, it's mind-boggling, and there are people who have studied this for years. And however, the basic underpinnings of these voting systems are so rudimentary, which is completely astonishing given the types of big data systems we were discussing today, machine learning possibilities and visualization methods and so forth. So just give you a synopsis of what we're looking at. How do you, if you take a collection of voting methods, like you choose for one candidate, which is what we do when we select the president in the UK, in India, and the United States. And if you have 5 candidates, you have 5 total expressions that are possible. Then if you take the voting through approval, you have 2 to the power k, or 32 possible expressions. And if you just rank order all the candidates in the 5, so you have about 120. So it tells you that by bringing in different voting systems, you're also playing with different rules, and that leads to a wider range of options. However, we often stick with the most narrow ones, which allows the least expressibility when it comes. And this was evident in the recent US presidential election. With 2 unpopular candidates, you were still forced to choose one, and there was no other mechanism to really express besides just picking one person. And similarly, there are other approaches that are available, and we sought out to do a head-to-head comparison of these in a real setting among vaccine decision makers to understand if they have an impact, and they did. And as part of a 4-week course at the Institute Pasteur, the annual vaccinology course. Chuck Phelps, who's here, and I conducted an experiment where we had 26 participants. We divided them into 2 groups, and one group simulated the health ministry and one simulated a finance ministry, and they played with the entire attribute list of the smart vaccines. And one group took a completely different approach. They took the discussion approach to winnow down about those 28 attributes into 5 that you see what they consider as the most important. Another group used a voting method to just bring it down to 5, and you can see there's a variation in the set of attributes that they each selected, and each of them ranked the attributes based on a Borda ranking, which was devised by a mathematician, a French mathematician Borda, to help the election process in the French Academy of Sciences in the 1770s. He was also influential in creating the metric system. So it's a very historic approach where you just rank the candidates that are most important to you, and then you sum the points attached to each candidate. And then the other approach we looked at was letter grading, simple academic letter grading, what's called majority judgment, devised by French scholars Michel Belinsky and Larocque. And you can see how the voting approaches are completely different. And the majority judgment offers more expressive possibilities. You can have a rank order 1, 2, 3, 4, but still have a letter grade of A, A, D, F. So which shows that you can have a better way of using a vocabulary that's not too constrained. So summarize the results here. You can see the border rank, if you look at the health ministry here, they were comparing 3 rotavirus vaccines, and that's what both the ministries were doing according to their set of attributes. And you can see the rotavirus vaccine had scores of 17, 27, and 30, but if you use majority judgment, the same health ministry had a different score, 26, 36, and 34, which means there was a rank reversal between 2 candidates here, which means by merely changing the rule and the voting method, you change your decision. And this is just the health ministry. And you look at the finance ministry, a similar logic. So this is a serious human factors issue that we know is a core tenet of systems engineering and systems architecture. And how do you bring in not just the technical elements for it, but also human elements to it? And that's something that my colleagues and I are deeply involved in. We are conducting real-world experiments to gain a better understanding of how these ideas work in action and try to build them together, because it is not just the decision support tool that's important, but how does the tool actually work in process when people attach their value systems to it. And so that kind of overtakes some of the standard challenges that we have in modeling, which is how do you collect, collate, refine the data sets and maintain them in a repository, refresh them periodically. But this is also a supremely important challenge where the modeling and the visualization community could have a serious role to play in. And the issues that we're dealing with have serious consequences, especially when it comes to deciding what health technology one should develop going forward. In summary, there are a number of opportunities as a community that we could do to really elaborate this to a broader audience and accelerate the use of this architecture where you bring in a variety of components to support decisions. And as a society now, we are increasingly geared toward or demanding transparency and accountability. So I think tools wherever they're developed should keep these factors in mind. So with that, I'll conclude, and I thank you for the opportunity.